One is there are now stricter rules in place at buildings department. When you pull a permit and you want to elevate your building, they have sort of better quality control for how that's done. Obviously, when you think of actually raising a building, you think a lot of single-family housing, but it is actually possible for multifamily. So if you're raising buildings, they have increased standards about having to put that on their permit. There's going to be more inspections, and so they're looking at that. Go ahead. Sewage backflow. So when you have a flood and water sort of covers up the the sewer system can actually become what they call supercharged and go the wrong way and go into the basement of the building. If you were in a building that had sewage backflow into your basement during Sandy, you know that you never want that to happen again. What's in the sewer, once it's in the sewer, is basically toxic waste. And so basically buildings can put in a one-way valve that lets water out, as sewage, but does not let the sewer backflow into the building. And so this law increased the requirements where buildings have to have these backflow devices. Go ahead. Much of what we looked at in the task force is actually removing code barriers. There were several areas where buildings might like to do the right thing to be more resilient, but code actually stopped them from doing so. And so one thing we could do on the task force is work with government to actually remove these barriers to doing the more resilient thing. One issue is that obviously everyone wants to raise their building equipment out of the basement if they're in a flood zone, but in certain cases, especially for telecom equipment, there was a limit to the length of the cabling you could have inside the building. And so this law allows longer telecom cabling inside the building, i.e. now you can have enough cabling that you can raise the equipment up above the flood elevation. So that will help with the resiliency of that equipment. And when I say telecom, you think of phones, but it could also be things that serve cell phone equipment. It could be things that serve the fire alarm system. So it really is a safety item. Also a big one is fuel tanks. And this is sort of a very interesting historical sideline for the city. After 9/11, it became very clear that burning fuel at a higher elevation in a building could be an incredible safety hazard. It could actually cause building failure. And so the result was laws that said that fuel oil in a building had to be stored basically on the lowest level. You really didn't want the fuel oil anywhere but at the bottom of the building. Of course, it turned out that if you're in a flood zone and your building floods, having your fuel tanks below the flood line also is a risk. And it's a risk because of the spills and it being toxic, but a risk because you lose your generator if you can't get the fuel out. So part of what the task force did was sort of hammer out a compromise between these two things. You can have up to 3,000 gallons on the lowest floor over the flood line. So even if you're burning, 100 gallons an hour, you should be able to run for 24 hours. It's much easier to get a fuel truck in once a day instead of, for a big building, you could be having them there once an hour with a smaller tank, and that just wasn't possible. Okay, great. I'm trying to see. Oh, flood shield. So one thing that is interesting that other cities do, and New York has not done historically so much, is have neighborhood-wide flood protection. And other cities do things where, for example, waterfront properties will have a standardized type of flood shield, and when the flood's coming, every owner who sort of faces the shore puts in their section of panels, and it forms a sort of continuous barrier. We don't do that, although actually, as was discussed, we are talking about more types of perimeter defenses. In the meantime, individual buildings may want to build a flood barrier. However, if you're built up to the lot line, this is biggest problem here in Manhattan, but it also happens other places. You're not allowed to put the barrier in the street. That's not your property. And so how is a building that's up to the lot line supposed to have a flood barrier? And so what this law does, it allows owners to put in footings for the barriers that will actually project up to 12 inches into the street. So you can't have the barrier there all the time in the street, but you can have the footing there in the street if you get a permit for it. And so when the flood comes, you can actually place your barrier on the sidewalk line, on the other side of the sidewalk line, so your building will be safe during the event. You can also have up to 6 inches on the walls if you need some type of backing for the barrier, some type of support. Obviously, the barriers have to be taken down, as soon as reasonably practicable after the event. You can't have the sidewalk blocked, but this gives more options, again, for owners to do things to keep their buildings safe. So let's talk about power. Power can go out from a flood, but it could also go out for almost any source, including not just natural disasters. And so lots of buildings that were without power during Sandy said, okay, let's get a backup generator in here. Well, so a couple things. Number one, backup generators can have some issues with being fully reliable. You have to test it every month, but even then, there were a lot of people that found that when it came time to fire it up after Sandy, it didn't work. There's obviously the fuel tank issue. And of course, the fact that they're loud, and even when you test them, when you're burning diesel fuel, there's, various issues with the emissions. The code either outright prohibited or discouraged through various means natural gas generators. So one of the things we worked on the task force was to make it easier for people to put in natural gas-fired generators. As I said, I was basically forced out of my building because of lack of water. If it weren't for that, and this was true for many people, it might have been able to stay there, indefinitely. I had little solar-powered flashlights that we used at night, and we used to go up and down the stairs, and that might have been good enough. But without being able to flush the toilet or wash, it was really hard to stay there for a long time. We're very blessed, actually, in New York by having a reservoir system that is higher than the elevation of the city. So most of the city buildings, up to the 4th or 5th or even 6th floor, you can get water. In my building, it was unclear if that water was available. It was unclear where you would go to get access to that water, if there's any place to get it. And in some buildings that have a pump that serves water to the upper floors of the building, that pump, when it's dead during a power outage, might actually block the water supply that's coming from natural pressure. So this law would mandate that residential buildings supply drinking water without power during an extended power outage. It only applies to buildings over 5 stories, and says that somewhere in the building there has to be a publicly available water fixture. So during a power outage, residents can go with a bucket, basically, and fill up their bucket so they can have some access to water. And it has to be unblocked by the water pump in the building. This was one of the very, very few task force proposals, of which there were 33 in total. 15 or 16 are now law. This is one of the very few that actually applies retroactively to buildings that already exist. So multifamily buildings over 5 stories have 8 years from the 1st of October of this year, so you have until October 1st, 2022, to retrofit buildings with this fixture. You have to have 1 fixture per 100 residents. That's based upon a calculation of how long it takes to fill buckets and how much water you need to, for basic sanitation, and so how many fixtures you need to have people have access to, so everyone has a chance to get water. And these buildings will have to be retrofit. You can get the full details again on our website. And then finally, relocating and protecting building equipment from floods. The code will now be tightening the types of equipment that cannot be located below the flood elevation, especially in terms of fire protection, some of the electrical gear. You can read all the details on the website, but for new construction or buildings that have a renovation permit that actually triggers this section of the code, it'll be much stricter about what you can put below the flood elevation. I'm not going to cover some of the other local laws that don't seem to apply as much to multifamily buildings or that aren't focused on flooding. But again, if you grab the task force report, you can see all of the laws that have been passed. There's also on our website, we keep a legislative tracker that shows the status of all the task force proposals, and you can get more information about them, brief description, and a link to the local law itself.